Picture this. You are standing at an altitude of, well, over 14,000 feet. The air is so incredibly thin that just taking a few steps leaves your lungs completely burning.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
I mean, your heart is just hammering against your ribs before you even do anything.
right, exactly. So it's late October 1962, and you are high in the Himalayas, deployed in this landscape that feels, honestly, way more like the surface of the moon than planet Earth.
Yeah, there are basically no trees,
Mm.
just jagged rock, frozen sand and blinding white peaks all around you.
And the temperature is absolutely plummeting as the sun goes down. There's this wind howling through the narrow mountain passes, and it's just cutting right through your heavy winter gear.
Which is a terrifying scenario to even visualize, really,
It is.
because it represents the absolute edge of human endurance.
Yeah.
And that's before a single shot has even been fired. I mean, you're fighting the environment long before you're fighting an enemy.
Yeah, exactly. And the men standing in that freezing wind were about to face an unprecedented assault. So today we are going really deep into the battlefield logs, the tactical history, and the strategic doctrine of the 1962 Sino-Indian conflict.
Right. Specifically, we're looking at a truly pivotal moment, which is the Battle of Chushul.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive is to understand how a few desperate but incredibly well-prepared men managed to hold off what was, effectively a tidal wave of attackers.
And this is fascinating because the 1962 conflict is usually studied from this huge macro perspective.
Right, like the broad political stuff.
Exactly. The shifting alliances of the Cold War, the massive border disputes between two giant Asian nations. But when you zoom in on the tactical, ground-level reality of Chushul, it's just a profound study in military doctrine.
It really is. It highlights this brutal, rapid evolution of defense under extreme pressure. Which brings us to the central question we are going to explore with you today.
The big why.
The big why, exactly. Because in the initial phases of the 1962 conflict, Indian forces faced these severe, really rapid reverses in several areas. I mean, it was a chaotic, dark time for the military. Entire positions were just overrun.
Just completely wiped off the map, yeah.
But Chushul was remarkably different. The performance of the troops, the execution of the battle plan, the ultimate strategic outcome, it was just a totally different story.
A complete paradigm shift.
Right. So the underlying question driving our entire conversation today is, why did the defense of Chushul perform so differently compared to those earlier devastating battles?
And to really answer that, we can't just look at the day of the battle itself.
No, you have to go way back.
Exactly. We have to look at the anatomy of the engagement from the ground up. We basically need to build a mental map of the battlefield for you, understand the geopolitical assumptions that dictated where troops were placed,
Yeah.
and then dissect the meticulous defensive preparations.
Because those preparations fundamentally changed the math of the whole conflict. So let's start with that mental map. Because understanding the strategic prizes, well, it's the only way this makes sense. Why does this specific piece of frozen earth matter so much?
Right. From a purely geographic standpoint, Chushul was basically a cold, hard strategic asset.
Yeah.
But one that eventually evolved into this matter of intense national honor.
Because it was the absolute pivotal point of the frontier posts in this whole sector of eastern Ladakh, right?
It was. So let's construct that geography for you. Imagine this narrow, really sandy valley. It's about 25 miles long, but it's only 4 miles wide.
Okay, 25 by 4. That's pretty narrow.
Very narrow. And as we mentioned, it is sitting at a staggering 14,230 feet above sea level.
Which is just wild to think about fighting a war at. And it's flanked by mountains that are even higher, right? Some of these peaks rise over 19,000 feet.
Oh yeah, massive peaks. So you essentially have this narrow strip of relatively flat land locked entirely between towering, impassable rock walls.
Right. And to the north of this valley, the land touches the Pangong Tso.
Yes, which is a massive, incredibly deep saltwater lake.
Which I've heard is just stunningly beautiful.
Visually, yes, it's often described as one of nature's most glorious sights, reflecting the sky like a mirror. But from a military perspective, it's a massive natural boundary.
Because you can't exactly march an army across a freezing lake.
Exactly. You just can't do it. But near Chushul, there is a geographical feature that dictates absolutely everything that happens in this theater.
The Spenger Gap.
The Spenger Gap, yes.
And what exactly is that for those visualizing it?
Well, the Spenger Gap is a physical break in those 19,000-foot mountains we talked about. It leads directly to another lake, the Spenger II, which extends well eastward right into Chinese-controlled territory.
So it's essentially a massive natural highway, or what military strategists call a mobility corridor,
That's
right?
the exact term, yes.
It's a gap carved through impassable mountains that physically funnels anyone coming from the east right toward the defenders in the Chushul Valley.
That is precisely what it is. And here is where we must apply a core strategic concept to our mental map. Geography plus air access equals strategic value.
Right, because Chushul wasn't just a barren valley. Critically, it held an all-weather landing strip.
At 14,000 feet.
I really cannot overstate what an incredible logistical lifeline that is. I mean, in a landscape where moving 10 miles by road could literally take days, an airfield is priceless.
It's everything. It is the only way to rapidly move troops, equipment, and crucially heavy machinery into a theater of war that is otherwise entirely cut off by extreme terrain.
Right, because Chushul was only about 15 miles from the border as the crow flies.
Yeah, but its real value was what sat geographically behind it. It's at astride the second primary route into Tibet from Leh.
Leh being the major administrative and military hub located, what, about 120 miles further west?
Roughly, yeah. And to get from Leh to Chushul, you have to travel a treacherous road that rises to nearly 17,000 feet, crossing the Ladakh Range at the Changla Pass.
Which sounds completely miserable.
It is desolate, windblown, and just steeply descends into Tangxi before finally reaching Chushul. So, if an invading force takes the Chushul Valley, that entire route to Leh is suddenly wide open.
The door is unlocked.
Exactly.
Okay, but hold on. If Chushul is the undisputed lock on the door to Ladakh, why in the world was it initially defended so poorly?
Ah, that is the big question.
Because looking at the broader history of 1962, the initial Indian deployment seems, well, strategically contradictory. If Leh falls, the whole region falls, yet they barely had anyone out there at first.
It's a phenomenal question, and it cuts right to the heart of why the early phases of 1962 were such an utter disaster. It comes down to geopolitical assumptions totally overriding military reality.
Right. The politics got in the way of the tactics.
Exactly. And this is where we have to discuss the forward policy.
The forward policy. Yeah, this term comes up constantly in the historical analysis we reviewed for this deep dive. What exactly was the thinking behind it?
Well, the forward policy was driven by a strong belief in New Delhi that the Chinese would not escalate border skirmishes into a full-scale organized war.
So they thought it was just going to be posturing.
Exactly. The assumption was that if India aggressively established a series of small forward outposts right along the disputed border, it would stake a physical claim to the territory and essentially deter Chinese patrols.
So they were basically just planting flags. But they weren't building fortresses. They were just putting a handful of men in incredibly isolated positions.
Right. The military term for this kind of deployment is tripwires.
Tripwires. Which sounds incredibly dangerous for the guys on the ground.
It is. A tripwire force is fundamentally not designed to stop an invading army. I mean, it completely lacks the numbers, the heavy weapons, and the defensive depth to do so.
Its only real purpose is to just signal that an invasion is happening.
Exactly. To force the attacker to formally engage, to shoot at uniform-wearing soldiers, and thereby trigger a larger geopolitical conflict.
But for the human beings acting as that tripwire, I mean, it is an unbelievably vulnerable position. They are sitting out there knowing they absolutely cannot win a fight if one starts.
It is practically a suicide mission if deterrence fails. And in this sector, deterrence was rapidly failing. Because the Chinese had a massive geographical and logistical advantage that made the forward policy highly dangerous.
Right. So let's transition into that Chinese advantage. Because while India is dropping these isolated patrols onto mountaintops by helicopter or, long foot marches, the Chinese are approaching this entirely differently.
Completely different.
The Chinese were operating as a prepared attacker.
Right. And a prepared attacker always focuses on logistics first. The Chinese had actually spent years building a road network from Rudak, deep in Tibet, right up to the Spangur Gap.
And to be clear to you listening, this wasn't just a dirt track for foot soldiers or pack mules. This road was engineered to be capable of carrying heavy trucks and armor.
And that one detail changes the entire mathematical equation of the battlefield. There's a saying, amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics.
Wow, yeah, that makes perfect sense here.
Right. A tank-capable road means you possess the ability to project heavy, sustained power. It means you can bring up thousands of artillery shells, massive fuel reserves, and heavily concentrated infantry forces right to the edge of the line of contact.
You aren't trickling men in, you are massing a fist.
Exactly. You are building a fist.
And while the Chinese are building this massive logistical fist, The Indian side is still relying on these tiny tripwire posts, and the disparity is just shocking when you look at specific incidents from the spring and summer of 1962.
Oh, the earlier incidents are really telling.
Yeah, take the Alpha Post incident in May. You have a post manned by one junior commissioned officer, a JCO, and 14 other ranks of the Jammu and Kashmir militia.
Right, and for listeners who might be unfamiliar with the structure, a JCO is a senior enlisted leader, sort of bridging the gap between non-commissioned officers and commissioned officers. And other ranks refers to the enlisted soldiers.
Okay, so you essentially have one experienced sergeant equivalent and 14 riflemen, 15 guys total.
Yes, just 15 men.
And this tiny group of 15 men gets completely surrounded by two entire companies of regular Chinese troops. We're talking hundreds of soldiers.
Hundreds.
And the orders given to the Alpha Post from high command were that the post had to be held at all costs, 15 men against hundreds.
It really highlights the absurdity of the political mandate clashing with the tactical reality on the ground.
Absolutely.
And what's fascinating is the Chinese troops advanced to just 120 yards away and simply got into attack formations. They didn't even immediately fire.
They just stood there with their weapons ready.
Yes, essentially daring the Indian troops to pull the trigger first.
Man, that is textbook psychological warfare.
It is an active attempt at intimidation. You see, the Chinese doctrine heavily emphasized breaking the enemy's psychological will before physically destroying them.
Right, get them to break themselves.
Exactly. They were testing the resolve of these isolated defenders, hoping they would panic, fire a wild shot, or simply surrender. But the JCO held his nerve.
He didn't blink?
He didn't. He maintained strict fire discipline. His men held their ground, and eventually the Chinese actually withdrew.
Which is incredible, but they used these psychological tactics repeatedly, right? I mean, on July 10th, a Gorkha post is surrounded, this time at just 200 yards. And the Chinese actually bring out loudspeakers.
The loudspeakers, yes.
They start broadcasting messages across the valley, trying to convince the Gorkhas, who are ethnically distinct from the rest of the Indian army, that they have absolutely no stake in this fight.
Right, telling them they shouldn't be dying for India.
Yeah, it's wild.
Again, we see the communist doctrine of demoralization and subversion at play. I mean, why spend ammunition and lives capturing a post if you can literally talk the defenders into abandoning it?
Right. But Subedar Jang Bahadur, who was commanding the post, completely rebuffed them. The logs say he shouted back, told them to basically back off, and once again, the Chinese decided not to escalate to a firefight that day and withdrew.
It takes immense bravery.
It really does. So hearing these stories of immense bravery, I have to wonder, if these early posts were just tripwires, what was the actual plan when the wire finally got tripped?
That is the tragic part.
Right. I mean, did High Command think these 15-man posts would magically hold off a battalion? Or was it purely a sacrifice to buy time?
From the sources, it appears the gravity of the Chinese logistical buildup just wasn't fully respected until it was entirely too late.
They just underestimated it.
Massively. There was no grand master plan to rapidly reinforce these posts once hostilities commenced. By September 1962, the entire area was defended by only the 114th Mountain Brigade.
Which was vastly under strength.
Oh, incredibly under strength. They had just 2 battalions, the 1st Battalion of the 8th Gorkha Rifles and the 5th JAD. And worse, they were strung out in dozens of tiny pickets across this massive, rugged frontier.
So they were just isolated targets waiting to be hit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They had no depth. When the political deterrence finally evaporated and the first massive phase of the Chinese assault actually began in October 1962, the result was just mathematically inevitable. The prepared attackers simply rolled over the scattered defenders. The Chinese overran major border posts across a massive front, from Daulat Beg Oldi near the Karakoram Pass all the way down to Demchok.
So the tripwires didn't just snap, they were completely vaporized.
Vaporized is the right word. And that profound shock, that catastrophic loss, is what finally broke the spell of the forward policy.
Reality finally set in.
It did. The realization hit high command that isolated posts were completely, utterly insufficient. You absolutely cannot stop a concentrated mechanized force with scattered riflemen. This catastrophic realization forces a fundamental overhaul in strategy. The survivors and reinforcements of the 114th Mountain Brigade fall back to Chushul, and they decide they are not going to be scattered anymore. They're going to build a wall.
And this wall is where the entire narrative of the 1962 war shifts, because the 13th Kuman Battalion arrives to reinforce the brigade in late October,
Yeah.
and the brigade commander, Brigadier Tien Reyna, is now faced with this massive tactical dilemma regarding the terrain around Chushul. He basically has to decide where to make a stand.
Right. So Brigadier Reyna looks at the Chushul Valley and sees two primary options for a defensive line. The conservative option, let's call it option 2, is defending the heights on the west side of the Chushul Valley.
Which, just looking at a map, naturally seems safer, right? I mean, you pull your forces back, you use the wide, flat valley floor as this massive buffer zone.
A huge kill zone, essentially.
Right. If the Chinese come through the Spanger Gap, they have to cross miles of open ground while you shoot down at them from the western mountains. It sounds like a great plan.
Tactically, it is a very sound, very conservative defensive posture. It maximizes your visibility and your fields of fire. However, war is not just about killing the enemy. It is about protecting assets.
Ah, right.
If you choose the Western Heights, you are completely surrendering the valley floor to the Chinese. And what sits in the middle of that valley floor?
The 14,000-foot all-weather airstrip.
Precisely. If you take the safe Western Heights, you hand the Chinese the airfield.
And without the airfield, you lose your only strategic lifeline for resupply and reinforcement.
Exactly. You might survive the initial attack, but you will slowly starve or run out of ammunition. Therefore, Brigadier Reyna makes a bold calculation. Option 1 is the only viable strategic choice, holding the heights east of the Chushul Valley.
Even though it puts his men right up against the Chinese border, right in the absolute teeth of the Spanger Gap.
It is an incredible risk. But by holding the eastern heights, specifically the dominating terrain features named Gurung Hill, Magar Hill, and Razangla, you block the exits from the Spanger Gap.
You cap the bottle.
You cap the bottle. You prevent the Chinese from ever deploying into the valley. And crucially, you keep the airfield behind your lines fully operational. You are trading safety for strategic depth.
Wow. Let's break down exactly how Reyna orchestrates this deployment then, because it is a masterclass in what military tacticians call mutual support. It's the exact opposite of the forward policy we were just talking about.
Right. He is no longer scattering his forces. He is interlocking them.
Okay, so let's walk through the map. In the north, at a place called Lukung, he puts the 5th Jet Battalion.
Yes.
At the actual mouth of the Spanger Gap itself, he places one company of the 1st 8th Gurkha Rifles.
Right in the center.
Then, on Gurung Hill, which acts as the northern shoulder of the gap, he places another company of the Gurkha Rifles, and he supports them with 2 trips of tanks.
And we really need to highlight that. The inclusion of armor at that altitude is astonishing. We will certainly explore the mechanics of that shortly.
Definitely. Then, on Razangla, which is the southern shoulder of the gap, he puts one company of the 13th Kuman Battalion.
Right.
On Magar Hill, slightly behind them, 2 more companies of 13th Kuman. And finally, at the Thakung Heights, 2 companies of 1st Jat.
Now notice the geometry of that deployment. It's brilliant. If the Chinese try to push straight through the Spangor Gap, they take fire from Gurung Hill on their right, Razangla on their left, and the Gorkhas dead ahead.
It's a crossfire trap.
Exactly. If they try to attack Gurung Hill directly, the artillery and tanks can support the infantry. Every position is designed to cover the blind spots of its neighbor. This is the very essence of a cohesive defensive wall.
But, simply standing on a steep hill in an organized line isn't enough to stop a massive bombardment. And this is where the battlefield logs really emphasize a massive shift.
Preparation.
Preparation. For the first time in this conflict, the Indian forces actually had time to prepare. They were desperately short on local porters and heavy machinery, but the soldiers themselves just grabbed shovels and pickaxes and started hacking into the frozen earth.
Which is back-breaking labor at 14,000 feet.
Mm-hmm.
But the primary lesson we extract from this entire phase of the battle is that preparation multiplies combat power. 10 men in a deep bunker can hold off 50 men out in the open.
Right.
Under Brigadier Reyna's strict supervision, they completely transformed those mountainsides. Every single approach that was shallow enough to handle a Chinese tank was heavily mined. They lugged heavy weapons up the slopes.
And you mentioned the heavy weapons. The logs specifically talk about deploying 106mm recoilless guns to cover those tank approaches.
Yes, the RCLs.
I want to make sure everyone listening understands what that means, because recoilless guns sounds a bit like an oxymoron to me.
It does, but it's a vital piece of technology for mountain warfare. A traditional artillery piece relies on massive, incredibly heavy hydraulic mechanisms to absorb the massive shock the recoil of firing a heavy shell.
Right, otherwise the gun would just fly backward.
Exactly. And that mechanism makes the gun incredibly heavy and hard to move. A recoilless gun, however, is essentially an open tube. When it fires the shell forward, it vents an equal amount of explosive gas out the back of the weapon.
Oh, wow. So it pushes forward and backward at the same time.
Exactly. This completely cancels out the recoil.
Meaning you can have a relatively lightweight weapon, light enough for a few guys to actually carry up a mountain, that can still fire a massive armor-piercing anti-tank shell.
That's the genius of it. It gave the infantry organic heavy firepower that didn't require paved roads to deploy. And alongside these, they meticulously concealed their traditional field artillery and the tanks they had somehow managed to bring up.
And here's where we get to what is easily my favorite tactical detail from the entire conflict.
Oh, the deception.
The deception. It's so brilliant. They knew the Chinese doctrine relied heavily on massive, pre-planned artillery bombardments to soften up a target before the infantry attacked.
Right, that's standard Soviet-style doctrine.
So the Indian defenders decided to just give them a target.
They engaged in a brilliant campaign of visual misdirection.
They set up completely dummy gun positions. They created fake fuel dumps. And my favorite part, to simulate armor, they dragged out old, disused, broken-down bulldozers, draped them in camouflage nets, and parked them in exposed positions so they looked exactly like tanks from a distance.
It is the tactical equivalent of martial arts,
Yeah.
using your enemy's rigid adherence to their own doctrine against them.
Yeah.
The Chinese doctrine dictates they must destroy the enemy's armor and fuel before advancing. The Indian defenders understood this entirely, so they altered the enemy's perception of the battlefield.
It's literally a high-altitude magic trick. You are using literal garbage to draw high explosive fire away from the bunkers where your actual men are sleeping.
And it works, because every commander wants the enemy to expend their finite resources, their time, their focus, and their artillery shells on targets that possess absolutely zero strategic value.
Right. So the stage is entirely set. The defensive geometry is established, the real troops are dug deep into the rock, the minefields are armed, and the bulldozers are parked and looking incredibly menacing through the binoculars of the Chinese scouts.
And then the calendar turns to November 18th.
This brings us out of the planning phase and violently into the fog of war. The execution of the Chinese attack plan begins.
The storm finally breaks.
The morning of November 18th is described in the logs as unusually bitterly cold, even for 14,000 feet. There is a dense, freezing mist shrouding the entire valley. Visibility is down to roughly 200 yards.
I really want you to imagine the intense psychological pressure of that moment. You are huddled in a freezing trench. Your breath is crystallizing in the air. You can only see a couple of football fields in front of you into a wall of gray mist.
It sounds terrifying.
And, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the thousands of enemy soldiers are out there in the whiteout, massing for an assault. The silence before an attack like that is just deafening.
So what was this specific Chinese battle plan? We know they have this massive force. The logs mention elements of the 4th Infantry Division, the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, and a specialized unit called the Ali Detachment. What are they actually trying to achieve in this blinding mist?
Their ultimate strategic objective remains the Spanger Gap. They need to push their armor and logistics through that corridor. But as we discussed during our terrain analysis, you cannot simply walk an army through a narrow valley if your enemy has heavily fortified the mountain peaks on either side.
Because the moment you walk into the gap, you are subjected to plunging fire from above. They would just shoot down into the column the whole way. It'd be a turkey shoot.
Exactly. It would be a total massacre. Therefore, tactical logic dictates that the shoulders of the gap must be physically conquered and cleared before the main body can advance.
Right, the shoulders. So the northern shoulder is Gurung Hill, and the southern shoulder is Rezangla.
Correct. The Chinese High Command identified these two specific peaks as the primary, absolute objectives for the morning of November 18th.
Okay, so the attack commences shortly after first light. The agonizing silence of the mist is completely shattered by the roar of cannons. The Battle of Chushul officially begins at 04:35 hours with a massive Chinese artillery barrage.
And right away.
Right away, in the very first minutes of the battle, we see the immediate life-saving payoff of all that preparation.
The bulldozer deception works absolutely flawlessly.
Yes. The Chinese unleash this absolute torrent of high explosive shells tearing up the earth, and they are just pounding the dummy fuel dumps into dust.
It's incredible.
They are relentlessly shelling the empty, dummy artillery positions. They are blowing up the bulldozers. The battlefield reports specifically note that the Indian troops, hunkered down in their actual bunkers, had the immense satisfaction of watching the Chinese waste a staggering amount of precious ammunition on complete junk.
And we really cannot understate how vital that moment is.
Mhm.
In modern warfare, an artillery shell is a highly lethal, mathematically precise instrument of death.
Right.
Every single shell that detonated harmlessly against the steel blade of a broken bulldozer was a shell that did not collapse a bunker or shred an infantry squad.
It saved lives.
It directly preserved Indian combat power. However, no artillery barrage lasts forever. Eventually, the guns have to stop firing so their own men can advance.
Right. So the barrage lifts. The ringing in the defender's ears fades just enough to hear the sound of boots on the frozen rock. The infantry assault begins out of the mist, which brings us to the brutal, close-quarters reality of Gurum Hill.
Goring Hill, as we noted, was defended by just 2 platoons of the 1st 8th Gorkha Rifles. They were under the command of Captain P.L. Kerr. By 05:15 hours, his forward sentries report vague, shadowy figures moving through the dark mist.
Just ghosts in the fog.
And by 05:45 hours, the full weight of the Chinese infantry attack slams into their lines.
This is where the battle shifts from a story about preparation into an incredible case study regarding the integration of artillery.
Right.
Because Brigadier Reyna, back at brigade headquarters, is desperately asking for situation reports over the radio, he realizes Grung Hill is under severe threat of being completely overrun, and he immediately orders covering fire from his own heavy guns. The 38th Field Regiment replies, spinning their 25-pounder guns to face Grung Hill.
And this is a textbook example of calling in defensive fire. But listeners need to understand the mechanics of how indirect artillery actually functions in a situation like this.
Yeah, please explain that, because they can't see what they're shooting at, right?
Exactly. The 25-pounder guns of the 38th Field Regiment are miles away, tucked safely behind a mountain. The gun crews cannot actually see the Chinese soldiers they are trying to kill. They are firing blindly over the terrain.
So how do they aim?
They rely entirely on a single pair of eyes at the very front line, an observation post, or OP.
Okay. And the OP stationed on Going Hill, staring down the Chinese advance, is a young officer named Second Lieutenant S.D. Goswami.
And Second Lieutenant Goswami's role is arguably the most critical on the battlefield at this exact moment. He is peering through the mist, watching the Chinese human waves advance. He is mathematically calculating their speed, their trajectory, the wind, and he is radioing those precise coordinates back to the guns miles away.
The pressure on him is just unimaginable. If his math is wrong, the artillery shells land harmlessly in the dirt.
Or, even worse, what the military calls a danger-close situation goes wrong, and he drops high explosives directly onto the heads of his own Gorkha infantrymen.
Oh, man. But if his coordinates are perfect, the artillery shells fall exactly where the Chinese are massing their heaviest formations.
Exactly, neutralizing their numerical advantage.
And looking at the logs, Goswami's accuracy was absolutely devastating. The 25-pounder shells rained down from the sky, catching the Chinese forces completely exposed in the open ground. The severe casualties inflicted by the artillery actually forced the Chinese to halt and abandon their initial wave of attack.
That's the power of accurate fire.
In this first phase alone, the Chinese suffered 81 recorded casualties, while the defending Gorkhas suffered about 50 killed.
It was a brutal exchange. But it vividly highlights a fundamental doctrine of modern warfare. Accuracy beats numbers.
Accuracy beats numbers.
Right. The Chinese employed unprecedented human wave tactics, relying on sheer mass to overwhelm the defenders. But precise, coordinated, uninterrupted artillery fire can break the momentum of a vastly numerically superior force.
But the artillery raining down from miles away wasn't the only fire support the Gorkhas had. We have to talk about the tanks.
Oh, the tanks.
Because this element of the battle is simply mind-blowing to me. AMX-13 tanks fighting at 14,000 feet.
Yes. B Squadron of the 20th Lancers. Commanded by Second Lieutenant S.P.S. Baswani, the AMX-13 is a French-designed light tank.
I just have to stop and ask about the sheer logistics of this. An AMX-13 weighs roughly 14 tons. It is a massive hunk of steel and tracks. How in the world do you physically get a tank up the Himalayas to a 14,000-foot valley in 1962? You can't just drive it up a goat path.
You are absolutely right, you cannot. The roads on the Indian side simply could not support the weight of a tank column. Therefore, the Indian military executed what is still considered a monumental achievement of aeronautical
And they
logistics.
flew them back.
They flew them in.
That is insane.
They used heavy transport aircraft, specifically Soviet-built AN-12s. They managed to strip the tanks down, wedge them into the cargo holds of these aircraft, fly them over the peaks, and land them on that vital sandy airstrip at Chushul.
Wow. And we talked earlier about the psychological warfare of the Chinese loudspeakers, but the psychological effect of suddenly seeing heavy armor must have been immense.
Oh, terrifying.
I mean, the Chinese infantry are fighting in the highest, most remote mountains in the world, expecting to only face light infantry, and suddenly the mist parts, and they are staring down the barrel of a tank.
The AMX-13 provides a massive, immediate firepower advantage. While artillery fires in arcs from miles away, a tank can deliver direct, line-of-sight, high-explosive fire right into the teeth of an enemy formation.
It's basically a massive sniper rifle that shoots bombs.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
However, operating heavy, complex machinery at that extreme altitude, under extreme cold, comes with severe, often deadly complications.
Yeah, and this is a detail from the combat reports that just stopped me cold. As the Chinese pressed the attack, Second Lieutenant Baswani ordered his tank to open fire. But as they tried to fire the main cannon, they found that the automatic loading gear had completely frozen solid.
Yes.
Wait, an autoloader is a massive mechanized hydraulic system. How does that kind of heavy machinery just stop working?
It basically comes down to basic physics, metallurgy, and viscosity. At 14,000 feet in late November, the ambient temperature is so far below freezing that metal physically contracts.
Okay.
And more importantly, the heavy industrial lubricants and greases used in the breech and the autoloader mechanism literally turn into a thick glue, or they just freeze solid entirely. The mechanism simply jams.
So you are sitting in a steel box surrounded by hundreds of enemy soldiers charging at you, and your main gun is broken. How does a tank crew adapt to that? I mean, how do you bypass a frozen autoloader?
It requires a testament to the crew's relentless training and sheer physical willpower. The autoloader is designed to do the heavy lifting because tank shells are incredibly heavy. When it failed, Baswani and his crew had to switch to manual loading.
Oh, man.
I want you to imagine the environment inside that tank. It is a highly confined, cramped turret. It is freezing cold. Because you are at 14,000 feet, there is barely enough oxygen to breathe normally, let alone do intense physical labor. And under those conditions, they are manually deadlifting heavy artillery shells, wrestling them into the breech, locking it, and firing. It is exhausting, agonizing work.
But the reports actually note a stroke of incredible luck born out of that necessity, right? After they managed to manually fire a few rounds, the sheer kinetic heat generated by the cannon firing actually warmed the metal and thawed the frozen lubricants.
Yes, it allowed the autoloader to start working again.
The heat of battle, quite literally.
Quite literally. And once the system was operational, the tanks became an immovable wall. The crews fired high explosive shells point blank into the Chinese formations, completely decimating the ranks of the advancing infantry.
Just tearing them apart.
They fought relentlessly until they literally ran out of ammunition in the tank, at which point they would withdraw slightly, feverishly reload the tank from a stockpile, and drive right back into the fight.
It is an incredible display of firepower. But despite the mathematically precise artillery from Goswami and the devastating high-explosive shells from Baswani's tanks, the sheer overwhelming numbers of the Chinese forces eventually begin to dictate the reality on the ground.
Yes.
The logs describe the later waves not just as attacks, but as unprecedented human waves.
Because firepower can stall a wave, but if the enemy is willing to absorb horrific casualties and just keep walking forward, eventually they will close the distance.
Right. By 0900 hours, despite taking massive losses from the artillery and the tanks, the Chinese swarm the forward posts on Gurung Hill. The Indian defensive lines are decimated and cut off from each other.
But the Chinese press forward, desperate to take the peak at any cost.
And when the grand tactical plan finally breaks down, when the heavy weapons run dry and you are actively being overrun by hundreds of men, military doctrine essentially goes out the window.
It does.
The survival of the line suddenly rests entirely on the localized split-second decisions of junior commanders fighting in the snow.
And we see extraordinary examples of leadership at every single echelon during this phase. At the very front, right in the trenches, you have Subedar Amar Bahadur Gurung.
Right.
When the Gorkhas are initially thrown back by the sheer physical weight of the swarm, Subedar Gurung rallies his men, leads a desperate countercharge, and is mortally wounded while physically trying to hold the line together.
Wow. And slightly behind him is the company commander, Captain P.L. Kerr. He is severely wounded. He is bleeding, freezing, and he is watching as yet another massive Chinese wave develops in the mist. He faces a terrible, agonizing choice.
This is the absolute crucible of command, decision-making under extreme lethal pressure.
Yeah.
Captain Kerr looks at his dwindling ammunition and his bleeding men. He basically has two options. Option one, stand firmly on Gruong Hill, fight to the last bullet, and eventually be completely overrun and annihilated.
Which would be heroic, but it would end in the death of his entire company.
It's exactly. Option two is executing a tactical withdrawal to a secondary feature slightly to the rear called Camel's Back. He calculates that if he can get his surviving men there, they stand a much better chance of holding out and continuing to fight.
But ordering a retreat is arguably the hardest command an officer can give, right? Especially to troops like the Gorkhas who pride themselves on standing their ground.
It is deeply counterintuitive for them, but strategically, it is the correct tactical decision. He chooses to withdraw to save his remaining men and preserve what little combat power he has left for the next phase of the defense.
But withdrawing isn't as simple as just turning around and running.
No, absolutely not.
If you turn your back while actively engaged with an enemy that is 50 yards away, they will simply shoot you in the back.
Exactly.
To execute a withdrawal, you need covering fire. Someone has to keep the enemy pinned down while the rest of the unit falls back. And this necessity leads to what is arguably the most sobering, incredible moment in all of the battlefield logs we reviewed.
The ultimate sacrifice.
Yes, by Second Lieutenant Goswami, the artillery observer we spoke about earlier.
Right. Goswami has been awake all night, directing the artillery fire all morning. By the time Captain Kerr orders the withdrawal, the Chinese artillery and infantry have completely hammered Goswami's observation post.
It's just gone.
The three other men in his OP, his radio operator, his assistants, they are all dead. Goswami is completely alone on the peak.
Man. So Captain Kerr orders the retreat. Goswami knows he needs to provide covering fire so Kerr's wounded men can get down the mountain. But the Chinese infantry are swarming his specific position. They are mere yards away. There's nowhere else to direct the guns. So what does he do?
He picks up the radio, contacts the 38th Field Regiment miles away, and he calls for a danger-close artillery strike directly on his own precise coordinates.
I want to slow down and emphasize exactly what that means. It is an act of supreme initiative and just unimaginable self-sacrifice.
It really is.
Goswami understands the ballistics. He knows what a 25-pounder high-explosive shell does to a human body. He calculates with cold, rational precision that the only mathematical way to break the Chinese assault, shatter their momentum, and save his retreating comrades is to bring the immense, fiery, destructive power of his own artillery down directly on top of his own head.
And reading that in the logs, it strips away all the neat, clean academic talk of defensive geometry and strategic corridors.
Right.
It brings the abstract reality of war violently down to human bravery. It's hard to even fathom having the mental clarity, let alone the courage, to make that radio call while freezing to death and watching your friends die.
It really is. The artillery regiment receives the coordinates. They know exactly whose position it is. But they follow orders, the artillery strikes, the mountaintop basically erupts.
And the bombardment absolutely shatters the Chinese assault wave, providing the exact cover Captain Kerr needs to withdraw his men to Camel's Back.
And miraculously, Goswami actually survives the immediate blast radius of the bombardment. He starts to drag himself down the mountain following Kerr's men, but he is hit by enemy fire and collapses.
He lies there bleeding in the snow, in sub-zero temperatures, completely exposed to the elements for hours, until a friendly patrol finally stumbles across him in the dark night.
And he survives the battle, but the severe cold resulted in massive frostbite, and he tragically lost both his legs.
Yes. But for his actions, he was awarded the Mahavir Chakra, India's second highest military decoration.
It is a profound, defining example of leadership, duty, and the real human cost of holding a line. And, while we are analyzing the cost of this defense, we must briefly look at the southern shoulder of the Spanger Gap, Razongla.
We have to, because Gruong Hill was only the northern half of the Chinese objective. While Goswami and Kerr are fighting for their lives, C Company of the 13th Kuman Battalion is defending Razongla, under the command of Major Shaitan Singh.
Right. And the Battle of Razongla is so complex, so intensely fought, and honestly so legendary that it truly requires its own dedicated deep dive in the future.
Oh, absolutely. But to understand the full scope of why Chushul held, you must understand the sheer attrition that occurred there. For C Company, isolated on their peak, there was no tactical withdrawal.
Right.
It was a fight to the absolute finish.
The battlefield logs state that the guns on Rezangla finally fell silent around 2200 hours that night. Out of a total strength of 141 Indian troops deployed on that specific feature, 136 were killed in action.
It's an almost total loss.
Major Shaitan Singh was among the fallen. He was seen moving from trench to trench, actively reorganizing defenses and encouraging his men even after being grievously wounded. He was awarded the Param Veer Chakra, India's absolute highest military decoration, posthumously.
The Chinese suffered horrific casualties attempting to take the peak, but the Indian defenders fought until quite literally almost the last man was dead.
It is just a staggering, heartbreaking stand. So the fighting at Guring Hill and Rezangla was undeniably fierce. The Chinese took incredibly heavy losses, far more than they anticipated.
Yes.
But through sheer numbers and attrition, they did eventually take control of the northern and southern shoulders. Which brings us to the aftermath. How did this horrific bloodshed shape the final end of the conflict?
Well, this takes us to the tactical outcome, the ceasefire, and finally answering our central question of why this specific battle was different.
Right, let's get back to that. So on the night of November 19th, moving into the 20th, Brigadier Reyna and the High Command evaluate the overall situation. The shoulders are lost. Keeping the preservation of the force in view, a tactical withdrawal is ordered.
The remaining Indian troops are quietly pulled back from the forward Kailash range and redeployed on the higher mountains, slightly further west of Chushul.
The Kailash range, which includes the blood-soaked peaks of Guring Hill and Rezangla, passes formally into Chinese hands. Geographically, the Chinese achieved their immediate, localized, tactical objective of securing the heights overlooking the Spanger Gap.
They got what they came for, essentially.
But here is the massive, crucial pivot in the history. On November 21st and 22nd, a unilateral ceasefire is suddenly declared by the Chinese government.
Yes, and significantly, as they halt operations, they make absolutely no attempt to descend into the valley and capture the Chushul airfield.
They make no attempt to push their armor down that road toward Leh. They stop right at the shoulders.
Right.
They spent immense blood and treasure building a road from Tibet, massing an army and taking the gateway, and then they just stopped at the gate. Why?
Because the incredible ferocity of the defense of Chushul fundamentally altered the strategic reality and the cost-benefit analysis for the Chinese High Command.
Wow.
Which allows us to directly answer the central question of this entire deep dive. Why was Chushul so different from the disasters of the earlier battles?
If we look back at the earlier battles under the forward policy, we saw isolated posts. We saw 15 men expected to hold off a battalion. There was no mutual support, there was no artillery, there was no depth.
They were brittle tripwires that just snapped.
Exactly. But Chushul represented a complete paradigm shift. Chushul featured deeply planned, heavily engineered defensive preparation. It featured the seamless integration of fire support, like the deadly accurate artillery from the 38th Field Regiment.
It featured combined arms doctrine, the monumental effort to airlift AMX-13 tanks and use them as direct fire artillery at 14,000 feet.
And above all, it featured decisive, incredibly flexible leadership. You had Brigadier Reyna remaining calm and orchestrating the defense from headquarters. You had Captain Kerr making the agonizing but correct call to preserve his men.
And you had Goswami making the ultimate sacrifice to ensure that withdrawal succeeded.
The after-action reports point out a truly fascinating, almost unbelievable statistic. Out of all the Indian troops deployed within the 114th Brigade sector by November 18th, only 3 specific companies of 2 battalions actually ever engaged the Chinese in direct combat.
It's a tiny fraction of the force.
Right. The brigade was deployed so intelligently, with such interlocking fields of fire and high professional skill, that they inflicted massive, disproportionate costs on the attacker without ever having to commit their entire reserve force.
The Chinese achieved their localized goal of taking the peaks. But the Indian defense was so costly to the attackers, so well organized, and the secondary defenses established right behind the airfield remained so potent and unbroken that the Chinese simply did not dare push any further.
They realized that taking the airfield, let alone marching on Leh, would require a blood sacrifice they were simply no longer willing to pay.
Exactly. The strategic advance of an overwhelming army was halted by the preparation of a few.
We have covered an immense amount of historical ground, tactical doctrine, and human drama today. I mean, as we step back from the specific logs of 1962, we can really see how the lessons learned on those frozen peaks laid the groundwork for modern defensive doctrine.
Right, because the legacy of Chushul isn't just about the bravery of the men. It is about the mechanics of how they fought.
Exactly. When military historians evaluate the battle, they look at several core pillars that dictate success. First is the absolute necessity of terrain selection.
Understanding that sometimes you have to surrender safety to gain strategic depth, just as Reyna did by choosing the Eastern Heights to protect the airfield.
Right. Second is the undeniable power of preparation and deception. The simple act of digging deep, laying mines, and brilliantly using garbage, like those old bulldozers, to absorb the opening blow of an enemy's highly structured artillery doctrine.
And third is the integration of combined arms and overcoming logistical impossibilities. I mean, bringing armor to the roof of the world proves that firepower can be projected anywhere if the logistical will exists.
Absolutely. Fourth is the doctrine that precision always beats sheer numbers. Human wave attacks can be broken, not by matching them man for man, but by placing high explosives exactly where they need to go, perfectly exemplified by Goswami's agonizingly accurate target corrections.
And finally, it always comes back to the human element. The ability of commanders at every single level, from the brigade headquarters to a lonely, freezing trench, to make decisive, sometimes terrifying choices in the blinding fog of war.
Chushul proves that an organized, well-led defense can multiply its combat power exponentially, turning a localized defeat into a strategic halt.
It forces us to look at warfare not just as arrows moving on a map in a history book, but as an incredibly complex, chaotic system of logistics, geography, atmospheric physics, psychology, and raw human endurance.
It is the ultimate test of doctrine against reality.
Truly.
So as we wrap up this extensive deep dive into the Battle of Chushul, we want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Something that builds on the incredible ingenuity we've discussed today, but pushes it forward into the conflicts we see dominating the news today.
Right, bringing it to the modern era.
Think about that brilliant tactical deception at Chushul. Old bulldozers draped in camouflage, successfully masquerading as heavy armor.
Drawing all that fire.
They drew the first massive wave of enemy artillery and saved countless lives because the enemy was relying on binoculars and predetermined bombardment grids.
It was a physical, analog mirage on a frozen battlefield. It completely exploited the limits of human vision.
Exactly. But think about the battlefield of today. In our current era of relentless 24/7 drone surveillance, high-resolution satellite imagery that can literally read a license plate from space, thermal optics that can detect the body heat of a single soldier, and AI-driven targeting systems. How do modern armies pull off that same kind of vital, life-saving deception?
It's so much harder now.
If the Chinese had thermal drones in 1962, they would have seen the bulldozers were cold and the bunkers were warm. So in the 21st century, is the fog of war disappearing entirely beneath the gaze of technology, or is the fog just changing shape?
That is the question.
How do you hide a tank or fake a bunker when the sky is quite literally always watching?
It is a question that is keeping every modern military commander awake at night right now. The technology of observation has evolved, which means the technology of deception must evolve just as rapidly.
Definitely something for you to mull over the next time you see footage of modern combat. Thank you for joining us on this deep exploration of the history, the tactics, and the incredible people behind the Battle of Chushul. Keep asking the hard questions, keep building those mental maps, and keep diving deep.